Millions of Africans were enslaved and transported across the Atlantic Ocean to America in a brutal trade that lasted for many years. The slave trade had adverse and devastating effects on Africa's progress, ripping the continent of invaluable resources looted amid the loss of millions of lives. Enslaved Africans were forced to work on plantations in the Caribbean or America, in the plantations producing sugar and tobacco for consumption in Europe and America. In 1863, when the slave trade had already made substantial damage, the then President of America, Abraham Lincoln, issued the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring millions of slaves living in the Confederate States free. Freedom was born, but it took a couple of years before this message reached African Americans who lived in Texas. African American communities in Texas did not receive the news until Union soldiers arrived in Galveston, Texas on June 19, 1865, leading to an eruption of celebrations for the newfound freedom. June 19, widely called Juneteenth, is now a federal holiday celebrated within and beyond America. In the Gambia, the American Ambassador Sharon L.Cromer observed Juneteenth by visiting Gambia's historical sites. The top U.S. diplomat was joined on a cruise boat for a visit to Kunta Kinte Island by her husband Arnold Sobers Jr. and staff of the embassy to observe Emancipation Day. Gambia is one of the West African countries adversely affected by the slave trade, with the River Gambia, many tributaries providing routes for slave traders to access people for the trade. Marking the day with great humility and remembrance of the adversities inflicted on the African slaves, Ambassador Cromer spread flowers on the water to honor the victims of the slave trade. The poignant and emotional moment remembered the stories of fallen heroes.
Laying flowers in the Gambia River today in honor of the Africans who left these beautiful shores in bondage, crossed the Atlantic Ocean during the Middle Passage, and for Kunta Kinte, he landed in Annapolis, Maryland. And so we honor those slaves who took that passage across the Atlantic. In the same vein, Kunta Kinte's descendants also lay beautiful flowers in the ocean.
Sailing to Kunta Kinte Island's historical environment, which testifies to the encounter between the Gambia and the slave trade, the ambassador on her team explored the monumental edifice constructed by slave merchants to enhance the trade. The island's strategic location made it a contact point during the slave trade. Its waterways attracted different trades, which also ushered in the occupation of the Europeans.
1725, there's a big explosion. Then island was destroyed. That was accidentally killed 11 Europeans with many slaves. In 1830, it was abandoned by the English. No one lived on the island in those days. But according to the history, they told them to swim to guarantee their liberty, but they all drowned in the water. And from here to the mainland is 3 sea miles, which is 5 kilometers. But the last name of the island was Kunta Kinte Island. Michael Jackson broke with Jamal Jackson. He came here in 2009, and they changed the name of the island. That was 6th day of February 2011. Today we call it Kunta Kinte Island. Yeah, as I made mention to you earlier, West Africa was more affected badly because of the island we have.
This place is built by the oppressors to control the slave trade, where many Gambians were captured and enslaved. The ambassador was taken on a tour of the structure that has harbored African slaves during the trade. A gigantic number were transported to the West and many died.
Today we celebrate June 19, 1865 as Juneteenth by visiting the island of Kunta Kinte, who was a Mandinka and a Muslim who lost his freedom here in the Gambia. He was captured by slavers and shipped like cattle across the Atlantic, the Middle Passage, to Annapolis, Maryland. Kunta Kinte's story was documented by the author Alex Haley, who wrote the story of his ancestor, Kunta Kinte, in the famed book Roots.
Exploring the story of Kunta Kinte, the team proceeded to Juffureh, the home of the iconic hero Kunta Kinte, whose story gives African Americans a sense of pride and belonging. The ambassador visited the museum in Juffureh, the edifice archiving the history of the slave trade and the level in which the Gambia was exploited. The museum also contains items used during the slave trade, such as pistols, as well as historical narrations. Touring the museum would give the ambassador more exposure to Gambia's slave trade history. Aja Mariama Fofana is the 8th generation of Kunta Kinte. The ambassador paid a visit to Aja Mariama, who was hugely delighted by the visit as the story of Kunta Kinte was narrated. Pictures of Kunta Kinte on his generation, as well as Alex Haley, the great-grandson of Kunta Kinte, who authored Roots, were presented to the ambassador. The ambassador also visited Takota, the first female alcalde of Juffureh, who has been serving for many years. Ambassador Cromer had a fruitful engagement with the alcalde, who was happy to receive the team. She presented a visitor's certificate to the ambassador and received an umbrella from the American emissary. The ambassador's visit to various sites marks a unique commemoration of Juneteenth, a path that advances the embrace of Black independence and freedom. Recognized widely, Juneteenth is nowadays signed into law as a federal holiday by President Joe Biden in June 2021. This day avails African Americans a moment to reflect on the painful history as well as a celebration of freedom. Aminata is Sanyang, GRTS.